Okay. Right. Well, welcome to the IRDR special seminar, the first of our event of our academic year. And welcome to all of you joining us on the YouTube channel, and to those, of course, who are in this seminar room on obviously a strictly limited 25% occupancy basis. And most of all, of course, welcome to Dr. Randolph Kent, who I think braved both COVID-19 and also the intricacies of streaming in multiple formats to deliver the special seminar. So I just want to say a few words about Randolph. He's a continuing but still a long and distinguished career. He's now a visiting professor at King's College, where actually for many years he directed the Humanitarian Futures program there. He has various present affiliations, such as the OECD and a Humanitarian Passport. But of course, for his academic career, for many years, he worked for the UN in Kosovo, in Somalia, in Rwanda, and back in the 80s in Ethiopia as well. So a very long career with a great deal of experience. And also, I think we're marking this occasion that actually we've nominated Randolph for an honorary professorship of UCL. And also, of course, today is International Disaster Reduction Day as well. So with that, I shall pass over to Randolph. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Simmons. Peter, is a very, very kind remark. And may I also thank University College London and its Institute for Risk and Disaster Reduction for the opportunity to share my thoughts with you today. And of course, let me thank all of you who are taking the time to attend this meeting. And I look forward to your comments and questions. Planning from the future, humanitarian action in a transformative age, comes at a time when there is growing concern that the present humanitarian sector may not be adequate to meet the humanitarian crises, the disasters and emergencies of the present, let alone the future. And while there's been a plethora of initiatives to improve the sector, all too often they have been based upon a set of assumptions that are losing their relevance. These assumptions have been described as the Western hegemonic paradigm. Is there an emerging alternative? This exploration of alternative ways of understanding the contexts and factors which underpin crisis threats and their solutions, is primarily concerned with the loosely defined humanitarian sector's capacities to deal with ever more complex and ever more uncertain humanitarian crises. If, of course, the sector is not fit for the future, solutions may emerge for improving it through institutional change and methodologies that reflect our present understanding of the nature of crisis threats and mitigation. Or, alternatively, the assumptions that are made about crisis threats and appropriate action may stem from fundamental changes in the very assumptions that underpin humanitarian action, which may lead not only to different understandings about the nature of crises, but also to a different approach to solutions. So let me suggest some of these assumptions that might serve as guideposts on the journey for alternative perspectives. The journey will begin with an exploration of perspectives on what I will call reflections of normal life. An historic model, not ahistoric, and ahistoric model. Normal life versus aberrant phenomena. Spillovers, linkages and messes, the space and time dimension, empathy versus mutual self-interest. All of these are critical components of challenging the assumptions that we make about the present humanitarian paradigm. Then after that, I'd like to take the issue of transformative technologies as an example of what we'll call the normal life proposition and how it relates to humanitarian crises. We're going to talk about the progress paradox. We're going to talk about the impacts, interdependencies, and messes of transformative technologies and their humanitarian consequences. We're going to talk about transformative technologies and the links between natural hazards and conflicts. And then finally, in that section, this section that you can see, technological paradox and humanitarian crises. When we get there, if you're still with me, after 25 minutes, then it'll be your turn to make comments, ask questions, etc. And then what I'd like to do, out of your questions and answers and the previous points that were made, I'd like then to say and to propose specific conclusions about what might be considered as the humanitarian implications that can be drawn from this exploration. Namely, new perspectives on the sources of vulnerability, planning consequences of fluid space and time, the nature of a humanitarian actor, the search for innovation, new forms of collaboration, and a rationale for humanitarian action too little considered by the humanitarian community. So let me talk a bit about now the challenging paradigmatic assumptions. And you can see that I'm going to be talking about reflections of normal life. As I said, we're going to be talking about this as an ahistoric model, normal life versus aberrant phenomena, spillovers, linkages, and messes, and then the space and time dimension, and then empathy versus mutual self-interest. So let me begin with an ahistoric model. As one well-known analyst from the Overseas Development Institute recently commented, despite the wealth of critical reflection and self-examination, the humanitarian sector has difficulty applying the lessons learned from its mistakes. This is in part due, so she continues, to the fact that it is decidedly ahistoric, as humanitarians operate in a perpetual present. Such ahistoricism also maintains a short-term view of the humanitarian role. When today's recurrent and protracted crises demand that humanitarian practice must be grounded in long-term analytical perspectives. That ahistorical issue is of critical importance as we begin to look how to deal with the future. Another issue is the reflections of normal life. The proposition that humanitarian crises are reflections of normal life is, on the one hand, generally accepted. They are recognized to some extent as reflections of the ways that societies structure themselves and allocate their resources. Yet on the other hand, disasters are still predominantly seen as exogenous and unforeseen shocks that affect supposedly normally functioning economic systems and societies. However, what all too often have not been appreciated are the full implications of the normal life proposition. In this regard, a more comprehensive societal focus changes the way that crisis threats are defined and solutions posited. This focus, in turn, suggests that disasters and emergencies have also to be seen very fundamentally as reflections of the way societies structure themselves and allocate their resources. In this context, let me move to this issue of spillovers, linkages, and messes. Humanitarian crises have always consisted of complex systems of changing problems that interact with each other, exponentially more today, and certainly more tomorrow. No crisis driver is in itself the sole explanatory factor for a crisis event or its consequences. People are not confronted with problems that are independent of each other, but with dynamic situations that consist of complex systems of changing problems that interact with each other. These are defined as messes. And this concept is an important one for understanding and explaining the dimensions and dynamics of humanitarian crises. The need to understand and prepare for humanitarian threats and actions in terms of complex systems and interacting problems will become increasingly evident, and as such reflect ever more fluid manifestations of vulnerability. As I shall mention when coming to transformative technologies a bit later, the concept of messes narrows such things as the bifurcation, the divide, that is made between natural disasters and man-made emergencies. And yet, while there are perceptible moves towards recognizing the interconnectedness between certain types of humanitarian crises, for example, natural disasters and technological failures, there continues to be resistance in the humanitarian world to be resistance to accept, let alone plan for, the interdependent nature of most, if not all, crisis events. In that sense, some of the greatest mistakes are made when dealing with a complex mess by not seeing its dimensions in their entirety. Instead, carving off a part and dealing with this part as if it were a complicated problem, and then solving it as if it were a simple puzzle, all the while ignoring the linkages and other connections to other dimensions of that mess. This tendency to accept, if not reinforce, the dichotomy and to ignore basic causation and solutions can only be perceived as a convenience. And not unlike the reactions of the establishment in the time of Copernicus in the 16th century, politicians, policymakers, and planners all too often resist perspectives because it goes against their inherent short-termism. The short-termism found too often in too many institutions and their incremental approach to problem solving. Let me turn to something that I'm calling the space and time dimension. Humanitarian crises always have transformative consequences that go well beyond the geopolitical and socioeconomic boundaries of the event itself. As in physics, so too in the nature of normal life, dynamics are not constrained by fixed time and space. Their effects continue in various forms over time and across spatial boundaries. While these dynamics are inherent in all matter, they are becoming increasingly evident in a world that is overtly more interconnected. Trade, through movements of capital, people, and information, what we call flows. The normal life dimension of humanitarian crisis means that the drivers of such crises are parts of systems that are in constant flux. They are in a state of non-equilibrium. And in that sense, as I'll talk to you below a kind of technological paradox. Humanitarian crises also reflect the ever-fluctuating boundaries of normal life. And those boundaries are moving in myriad directions, including, by the way, beyond the Earth's atmosphere. And if I may just say parenthetically, it's interesting to consider in that normal life context the growing number of crisis drivers and ways to mitigate them that will become extraterrestrial. Extraterrestriality will emerge as a major factor in what we continue to call humanitarian response, and will fundamentally change many aspects of what is a crisis driver and who and what is a humanitarian actor. But more of that later on. The implications across the humanitarian crisis spectrum is that this more dynamic view of crisis drivers and their effects will call for different ways of understanding crisis drivers, for analyzing potential threats, and determining their scope and multifaceted dimensions. Humanitarian may eventually be understood as normal phenomena involving a wide range of self-interests and sectors. The linkages between short-term impacts and longer-term consequences may also require greater attention to longer-term perspectives and plausible future threats and transformations as an essential part of effective humanitarian action. If crisis threats may be viewed from a whole of society perspective, bound neither by space nor time, then technological change and concomitant globalization suggests that humanitarian crises ultimately have to be seen as global in their impacts. The implications of this perspective is, for example, that conventional distinctions between developed and developing will conceptually be less relevant, and that a more appropriate focus will be on ways that any single event triggers multiple and complex reactions globally. And in that sense, let me just talk a bit about the empathy versus mutual self-interest. From a humanitarian perspective, this assumption could suggest that such interactions mean that human beings, in the final analysis, are all potentially vulnerable, or at least affected at different stages of a crisis event, and therefore that response to crisis stems principally from a growing awareness of self-interest and mutual self-interest. While in no sense wishing to discount what might be seen as the inherent humanity in humankind, one cannot ignore the driving force of self-interest in addressing such vulnerabilities. This perspective, historically as well as futures-based, will become increasingly evident with, for example, and which will be discussed in a second under, if you like, transformative technological factors. And before concluding this section, let me just mention that humanitarian response is underpinned, as I've tried to suggest, by contending and not necessarily universal principles. The former, contending principles, reflecting cultural, local, and regional perspectives and values. As suggested by the renowned anthropologist Ajahn Appadurai, we will have to deal with contending and not universal principles. Now, let me just mention a few things about what we're calling here the technological paradox and humanitarian crises. I think the technological paradox fits clearly into the normal life proposition. Technological advances have been one of the most transformative factors in society over the past 3 centuries. These advances, though highly significant, are of course by no means the sole determinants of human action and humanitarian crises, and certainly that's not what I'm suggesting. And yet, in light of technology's transformative impacts, such transformative factors provide examples of the need for different underpinnings for understanding humanitarian action. Technology clearly reflects the inherent paradox of the normal life proposition, namely that advancing progress and shifting vulnerabilities are deeply intertwined. Technology-led, complex societal dynamics, what we earlier called the messes, may provide a very timely example of understanding the causes and crises, their dynamics and possible solutions, particularly in this age of what is called modernity and post-modernity. If one looks, for example, at the progress associated with the 19th century Industrial Revolution, it's worth noting that even the most beneficial developments have unpleasant consequences that must be managed. The Industrial Revolution, so profoundly important, was accompanied by soot-filled London skies and horrific exploitation of child labor. In the same sense that technological progress has and continues to determine economic growth, so too does it determine, in so many ways, how this environment, resources, and human interests and values are used and exploited. In that sense, technological progress changes the ways that vulnerabilities develop throughout societies. A great debate about the digital age as technological transformations increase at exponential rates concerns its potential impacts. Whom, for example, might technology make redundant? And what will be the consequences in terms of the economy and finance, infrastructures, and societal dynamics? Can indeed human beings keep pace with such change? All in various ways will determine the upside and downside of human progress. All in one way or another will suggest the dynamics of crises, the consequences and the fluidity of vulnerability. Technological advance results in different types of complex crisis drivers and in different types of vulnerabilities, offering, for example, perspectives on the interrelationship between natural hazards and conflict. The poverty and conflict that ensue due to such advances, be they the results of the pursuit of energy sources, raw materials, or the geopolitical space that is needed to gain them, demonstrate a clearly identifiable and intricate link between the consequences of natural hazards, economic drivers, societal vulnerabilities, and conflict. What I'd like to just mention is something that I think is of fundamental importance, and I look out over my audience, and I wish I could see the others. And I wonder what kind of construct, what kind of society will you be living in? And if you take the proposition of normal life and the vulnerabilities and the humanitarian crises so implicit, then let me pose one issue. Of fundamental importance when considering the link between technologies, normal life, and vulnerabilities is control. Who controls how societies will be structured and resources allocated? Just one case. Let's talk very briefly about developed versus developing worlds. While a growing number of analysts suggest that a middle class is emerging across the globe, they nevertheless forecast what essentially can be described as a continuation of geographical and socioeconomic divides between what we call developed and developing countries. Alternatively, geographically based and socioeconomic distinctions between wealth and poverty will be intensifying gaps between and across all state systems. Developing and developed could become a societal norm across all states. And to that extent, it then will become synonymous with deepening poverty that will cut across all societies. And where developed will mean sustainable wealth across those same societies, who will be the impoverished? Who will be the vulnerable? Where does humanitarian action fit in? Who will be in control? Now, thank you very much. I hope this makes some sense. What I'd like to do now is perhaps just give you a time to make comments, to ask questions, and I think what we're going to do is have 10 minutes, as I understand it, to do that. Or you might just want to relax, or dare I say, close your eyes and just get some rest. But having said that, are there any comments, any questions that you'd like to ask?
I have a question. Why do you think this ahistoric approach has been allowed to develop? There's been a lack of, I think, theoretical understanding. Why are we in that situation?
I think that is such a very, very important question. It comes to what I'd like to talk about in terms of change and collaboration in a global context. But having said that, I think, if I may put it this way, I think there are institutional constraints that limit the interests and, if you like, move or resist moving away from institutional comfort zones that mean that the way I view the world, the way I make decisions, are very much constrained. And I think, Peter, that might be one thing. And let me just mention in that context, you know, there was a project going not too far down the road where we said that what we needed to do is to take a look at organizational dynamics in terms of pandemics. And this was thrown back at us and said, well, you know, we have SARS, we know what happened with the Ebola crisis, and what more do we need to know? And I said, well, what would happen if you had bioengineered pandemics? What would happen if there was a pandemic here that you didn't know about? And, if you like, didn't really have the structures to respond? To which we were told, you have to understand that pandemics on the top of the national risk register. But the way they were looking at it was the way that they looked in previous pandemics, without ever considering how to modify, how to update, how to think differently, how to be substantively anticipatory. Peter, that's a very long answer to what was a very fundamental question. Are there any other points that you'd like to make? Please.
Can you just elaborate a bit on the issue about ignoring causation?
And maybe you should repeat the question.
Fine. And sorry, so I've been asked if I could comment on the reasons for the kind of causation we have. Did I, or repeat the question?
Why so many organizations ignore causations behind
Why organizations ignore causation in the ways that we've been talking about? I think that is such a profoundly fundamental issue. Just as a by the way, for those of you who have time, you might want to look at Oliver Letwin's book on apocalypse how. And the how goes back to your question, and that is because the bureaucratic structures, the organizational structures, and the interorganizational operations, if you like, constrain different ways of thinking, and dare I say, different ways of experimenting. And if I may just rely on just comments from my own career, I remember in the Sudan, the government gave us an unbelievable opportunity to bring our various agencies, UN agencies and international non-governmental organizations together in a combined opportunity to deal with crises in South Sudan, or what was then Southern Sudan. And what was really very interesting is, and the government had only one favor, it said, could we just ask this? And all of us said, oh God, here we go. The government's going to want to take control of what they're seeing. bring us all together, and then take control of the resources. And that's not what the government at all. The government said, what we would like you to do is, you, the United Nations, do it. And then, together, you can determine how best to do it. But, said the government, all we want is a single focal point to coordinate all of this. And all the resources will come into that one coordination body. And then all the agencies looked around, that slightly panicked look of, oh my God, I'm going to use the resources that I've been given, and what is the consequence for my organization? And then all of a sudden you found that the inter-organizational dynamics fell into organizational preservation. And that perhaps is one example of your very, very important question. Are there any other points you'd like to make? Please.
These paradigm assumptions that you said are problematic, do you think that is a new phenomenon, or have they always existed in humanitarian action since it's become?
Actually, I am so sorry. This is one of the problems with everyone being safe. I couldn't quite hear you.
Sorry, yeah. The paradigm assumptions.
The paradigmatic assumptions, yeah.
Which you mentioned are problematic. Do you think this is something that is new within the sector, or has it always been a part of humanitarian action?
Very, very good question. You know, and I think your question, and I'm sorry, this is the translation via the mask, and that is, have these paradigmatic assumptions always been there? Are they an inherent part of the whole humanitarian construct? And the answer is, let me take you back to another case. There was a country called East Pakistan, which is now Bangladesh. And I remember we were talking to some USAID official, talking about the operation, which involved dealing with hundreds of thousands of people who were afflicted by a cyclone. And we were saying, well, how was it? What did it look like? And I remember him drumming his fingers on the desk and saying, it was pandemonium run riot. What he was really telling us is that basically there was no structure, there was no system, there were no assumptions. There was development, there was the occasional NGO, but there was no humanitarian, there was no UN involvement in these kind of things. In fact, the UN felt that to get involved would be to, if you like, complicate its relations, complicate its balance with other states. Now, going back to your point, one began to evolve then a certain set of assumptions, part because of the capacities of Western states to determine, if you like, concerns, in part because more and more countries elsewhere were showing their vulnerabilities. So you had all sorts of, if you like, issues. And the paradigm then became, these are, if you like, one-offs. These are aberrant. This shouldn't happen. And then you had other aspects of that paradigm that was, you know, this South is inherently vulnerable. We, the North, are inherently resilient. So we can tell you what you need because we actually know better than what you do. So all of this thing began to meld into a set of paradigmatic assumptions, aberrant phenomena. What is vulnerability? The closed dimensions of what a crisis is, etc., began to evolve ever since, so to speak, that USAID official drummed his fingers on the table in front of us and said, it was pandemonium run riot. Does that answer your question? I think, if I'm right, we need to move on. And The bad news is you have to listen to me for another 15 minutes, but the good news is that there will be 10 minutes for questions after that. So let me just see. What I'd like to do is to talk about change and collaboration in global context. And now for those of you who are trying to see where is this all going, what are the practical, dare I say practical, it's a dangerous word, consequences of everything that I've said so far, that lets us sort of see how we can do in terms of new perspectives on sources of vulnerability, how we can talk about planning consequences. How do you plan for fluid space and time? How do you deal with the nature of a humanitarian actor? What do you do in terms of the search for innovation? And then, what do you mean by collaboration? And finally, what is the rationale for humanitarian action? So let me begin by saying that many of the assumptions that underpin traditional perspectives about humanitarian crises will change in the context of what might be regarded as the proposed new paradigm. Perspectives on vulnerability, the dimensions and dynamics of potential crisis drivers, a new conception of the nature of humanitarian crises, and who is responsible for addressing such crises, all in various ways, will demand fundamentally different approaches to the ways that humanitarian crises are defined and addressed. Preparing for humanitarian threats from a normal life perspective will require a new approach to anticipation. There continues to be resistance across many fields of expertise, be it in defense, business, or humanitarian affairs, to speculate about the what might be's. Conventional probability calculations, high risk and low probability, failure to explore complexity, opting for the linear and complicated rather than the lateral and complex, and failure to define what sort of objectivity defines evidence, all reflect varying degrees of unwillingness to go beyond comfort zones. Nevertheless, those concerned with the humanitarian consequences of a growing number of crises threats will inevitably be forced to go beyond their comfort zones in order to be more anticipatory and more sensitive to those messes and their enduring dynamics. In saying such, complexity may demand far more proactive and far more collaborative measures than is today's norm. In other words, those concerned with longer-term humanitarian threats will need to view normal life from an anticipatory perspective, where drivers may only be plausible, but not necessarily certain, where timeframes for speculation and analysis extend well beyond conventional planning cycles, and where multi-dimensional and multi-sectoral approaches underpin the search for understanding. No single actor or expertise will be adequate to effectively anticipate plausible futures. Anticipation, however, should not be confused with forecasting or prediction. Anticipation in this context suggests a willingness to be speculative, to recognize the importance of considering the potential impacts of a range of events which in turn could result in possible crises as well as ways to mitigate them. To be appropriately anticipatory will also mean that those seeking to anticipate future threats will have to be adaptive, willing to adjust not only their perspectives, but their procedures and operations, as well as to meet such challenges in order to remain sensitive to myriad threats and ways to offset them. Successful anticipation will demand a willingness to promote cross-disciplinary, cross-sectoral, and cross-cultural collaboration that few conventional humanitarian constructs promote. Who will be the humanitarian actors from a normal life perspective becomes a critical issue. The normal life perspective suggests that threats and their implications are fluid and borderless. As messes, they impact in myriad ways, creating diverse vulnerabilities as well as intensifying them. And in so doing, give a whole new meaning to the nature and dimensions of the affected. When it comes to those, they look at their and the whole new dimension of the meaning of self-interest. From a normal life perspective, that full panoply of self-interest defines not only crisis effects, but also the sorts of different approaches and understandings about ways to anticipate and deal with such crises. In that sense, the wide range of self-interests that result from messes means that humanitarian actors are not limited to any one sector, but self-interests and identified mutual self-interests can identify the various cross-sectoral, cross-disciplinary expertise and approaches that might be required. Using this perspective, in the words of a senior ICRC representative, we are all humanitarians now. In determining who is a humanitarian actor, the issue may not be between traditional and non-traditional actors, where the former defines the border in which the latter crosses. Rather, in light of the intensifying dimensions and dynamics of crisis threats, the issue may lead to the propensity to anticipate so-called humanitarian actors based upon perceptions of self-interest and mutual self-interest. Such perspectives may in turn lead to a process in which capacities to identify and resolve potential threats will be determined. That prospect raises the issue of who, when faced with a potential or actual threat, has the comparative advantages and the value added to deal with them. In a related vein, what sorts of mechanisms and platforms will transcend conventional humanitarian structures to make myriad self-interests mutual? While the prospect for the emergence of a normal life paradigm is still not clear, it is possible that such a paradigm might reflect a multidimensional and multi-sectoral approach for dealing with humanitarian crises that would be fundamentally different from the ways they are handled at present. One could foresee that the former might bring together the sorts of innovation, resources, and capacities for dealing with messes that the latter may not understand or be willing to do. The implications of what might be seen as an emerging alternative paradigm, alternative approaches and perspectives are many. Some of these are in various ways already reflected in changing attitudes about the nature of humanitarian action and its operational boundaries. That said, despite such changes, there might be less awareness that such changes reflect alternative assumptions about the very concept of humanitarianism. While paradigmatic changes per se may not in and of themselves be of paramount interest to humanitarian practitioners, the practical implications of an alternative paradigm are worth considering, and in this context, there are at least 6 issues that should engage those with humanitarian roles and responsibilities. First of all, the source of humanitarian action will be too complex and uncertain to limit the scope of planning, preparedness, and response to the immediate or to a single sector. To ensure that timely and appropriate preparation and response will be in place to meet future challenges, those with humanitarian roles and responsibilities must ensure that their organizations are inherently what we earlier called anticipatory. This is not, once again, a call for predicting the future, but rather an acknowledgement that greater attention has to be given to devoting organizational time to planning from the future. What might be out there? What should be taken into consideration? What are the what might be's? And that organization has to be sufficiently adaptive. It has to go beyond, if you like, the comfort zones, the stovepipes. Take a look at how best that it can respond to the what might be's. Secondly, I think fluid space and time as a planning consequence needs to be taken into account. The humanitarian development divide has been a persistent source of tension and debate over decades. The challenges for both sides, humanitarian development, is to deal with what earlier had been described as how do you deal with fluid space and time? The fact of the matter is that humanitarian planning and response cannot rest alone on ways to deal with a single spatially confined event. Any event, and certainly as we look to the future, will spill over into a host of others. And that means that planning has to begin by abandoning that well-known bifurcation, that separation between development and humanitarian. And with the creation of integrated planning methods, monitor and deal with potential spillovers. Integrated planning in this context will go well beyond development and humanitarian expertise into conclaves or a number of scientific and social scientific disciplines. Let me then turn to the third thing that I think for those who are taking the future seriously in terms of humanitarian consequences, and that is, what is the nature of humanitarian actors? The traditional humanitarian sector is faced with a humanitarian capacities challenge. As presently configured, it has neither the material nor human resources, nor the capacities to meet with ever more complex and uncertain humanitarian threats. This, in the first instance, means that humanitarians of the future will consist of a wide spectrum of actors, from the private and military sectors to the diaspora to cyber and social network groupings. Their utility will be based upon their comparative advantages and value added, and their involvement in humanitarian action will be motivated in no small part by what they perceive as their immediate mutual self-interest. In terms of the search for innovation, once one moves the concept of humanitarian action away from time and space-bound restrictions, the sources and identification of relevant of innovation for humanitarian needs also gain and must gain greater fluidity. Too often, traditional humanitarian actors begin their search for relevant innovation from their particular perspectives, what they feel and what they know the problem is, and then how innovations will fit into that, into their preconceived mindsets. Similar to the issue of anticipation and adaptive capacities, the search for innovation has to begin to look beyond self-imposed limits of discovery and has to actively seek what I guess could be called innovation intelligence that would introduce a multiplicity of actors whose innovations were by no means intended for humanitarian purposes. Stepping well outside the limits of discovery is a function as well as a reflection of effective anticipation and adaptation. Penultimately, let me say that we also need to think about new forms of collaboration. In recognizing that the nature of humanitarian actors will change, so too will the concept of collaboration. Hitherto, for many reasons, the traditional humanitarian sector presumed that collaboration was founded upon potential actors, such as the military and private sector, providing cash or in-kind support, according to the needs and procedures defined by the humanitarians. The emerging reality, however, is that an ever-widening group of actors will be engaged in humanitarian-related preparedness and response based upon their sectorally specific motives and concerns. Therefore, collaboration between traditional humanitarian and others will require a new form of collaboration. Collaboration based upon an appreciation of self-interest, respected value addeds, and comparative advantages. Now, finally, if I can just mention what I see as the rationale for humanitarian action. There is a propensity across the traditional humanitarian sector to explain and justify its activities by referring to a universal morality that underpins humanitarian principles. As discussed earlier, such assumptions ignore the very cultural, historical, sociological, and social psychological dimensions that determine different societal attitudes. For the traditional humanitarian sector, greater sensitivity to this increasingly evident reality means that for those wishing to be truly humanitarian, they will have to cease taking such universals for granted and begin to practice the art of constructing mutually empathetic values on a case-by-case basis, one emergency at a time. This is a hard prospect, perhaps our best one. A humanism prepared to negotiate across borders, unaccompanied by any non-negotiable universals. It is a humanism that recognizes that the so-called moral stance has too often led to disguised and most likely unintended condescension between provider and recipient. Mutual self-interest is a major step towards equality in a world where any crisis threat ultimately has global consequences. Thank you very much for listening. I certainly enjoyed the opportunity of talking to you and speaking to you, hopefully generating perhaps some questions or comments. And I think we have 10 minutes for them. Are there any?
Maybe just one question. Just in terms of the collaboration, you mentioned about the fact that, I mean, I suppose in the traditional model, you would have had NGOs or INGOs collaborating with each other, and now increasingly we're bringing in the private sector, we're bringing in all of these different contractors. But this is more maybe just to take a step back or a step forward on that, is what is your opinion about the proposed merger of DFID and the Department of Foreign Affairs in terms of how this will change basically I suppose the role, but also the levels of collaboration we can expect in the coming years. On the one hand, it may bring innovation, but on the other hand, it may lead to some, for example, deprioritization of countries which previously were on the DFID list. So I know it's maybe a very large question, but what is your opinion of that, and where do you see the pros and cons? Where do you see the cons?
Fine. And so let me just repeat your question, and that is that basically I think you were asking, with all of this, to what extent might there be, if you like, how would this be reflected, if at all, in such things as the merging of DFID with the FCO, with the Foreign and Commonwealth Office? Is that right? I mean, let me put it this way. I think to some extent, whether DFID goes to the FCO or not, my initial reaction is that we haven't gone beyond the conventional humanitarian paradigm. I think one might say that perhaps by bringing in the FCO, and this is sheerly speculative, that there might be a different perspective, on humanitarian crisis drivers that might be able to draw in other sorts of institutions, sectors, interests that could broaden the scope of the way we see humanitarian crises. But I think that would be, from my point of view, an optimistic observation. I think what we're really seeing is, if you like, a convenience that is not going to change the humanitarian sector per se. So I've completely convinced you, have I?
Jasmine, are there any ways we can pick up questions on the YouTube channel? Cool.
We don't have comments have been switched off, I'm afraid.
Oh, okay. Sorry about that.
No, not at all.
The idea of anticipation and adaptive capacities. I'm just wondering if you can think of any good case studies or real life examples of an organization or an actor that has demonstrated that.
Okay. Let me suggest Elon Musk. Okay. I think what one has to do is to go well beyond, if you like, the conventional humanitarian sector to see truly, if you like, adaptive and anticipatory capacities. Let me just build upon that point. I remember that I had to give a talk to a very large international non-governmental organization a couple of years ago. And we were talking about adaptive capacities and anticipatory capacity. And the chair, who I think was getting a bit tired of my, if you like, rantings about anticipation and adaptation, said, Randolph, this is why we have a policy planning unit. To which I replied, yes, but do the cleaners know? Who gets involved? I think it was Apple, many, many years ago, who I think had a large whiteboard in the entranceway, or maybe it was Google, and anybody who came in could put down his or her ideas. It's not where you were in the system, it's what kind of ideas you had. So my answer is, I've read an awful lot of efforts to analyze UN capacities and NGO capacities, etc., in my time. I've seen many, many well-intentioned reports, but you may remember from the outset of my remarks, that woman from ODI, Overseas Development Institute, who said that despite all of this, the humanitarian sector continues to fall in with its short-term perspective, with its ahistoric approach to crises. I hope that answers at least part of your question.
Okay, so I think yeah, so thank you very much.
Thank you.
So those were now the YouTube.
Okay, so thank you very much indeed, Randolph. Those are really interesting and thought-provoking seminars, so thank you very much for that. I'll just say that for what we would normally do at this point is to have, take this also that I'm talking so people can hear me, it would be to have a reception. Unfortunately, we can't do that, but what we would like is those who are on the YouTube channel, Yasmin sent through, or I sent through a Zoom link to go to that Zoom link and introduce yourselves to your fellow students. I think some of the staff will be joining that too, so do that. For those in the room, there was a suggestion, oh, maybe we can have some drinks or something like that, but fortunately that's just not allowed. So I'd ask that occasionally maybe walk up here and then look who's on the Zoom channel here, but also socially distance, of course, introduce yourselves to each other if you don't know each other yet, and at least have a little bit of social interaction to try and get to know each other a little bit. And the same, say, for those who are going to join the Zoom welcome as well. I think we just should try and taking these difficult times, sort of every opportunity that we can to have that sort of social engagement, even as constrained as it is at the moment. So again, thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
So now we grab all our equipment.
Yeah.